Good morning. Welcome to our panel discussion on regulatory convergence for ATMPs. I will introduce myself and then introduce our panelists. So I'm Anne-Virginie Eggimann, or AV. I'm Chief Regulatory Officer at Tessera Therapeutics, a genome editing company. So global regulatory convergence is the new kid on the block for ATMPs. We rarely talk about harmonization anymore. The new trendy words are reliance, joint reviews. And basically, my key message here is global regulatory convergence is happening for ATMPs, and we'll have some words on that in a minute. And I think it's really a sign of maturity in our field, and we should embrace that. So there's a lot to accomplish in that area, though, and we're basically only going to scratch the surface today. But the point of our panel today was to actually use a concrete example to illustrate how global regulatory convergence can happen or can start, or what are some of the principles that can be used. We talked about having common terminology, aligning on key principles, key concepts, and basically the whole point is to have efficiency for sponsors when they want to develop their products globally. So we're fortunate enough to have folks from MHRA and EMA today on the panel. They're joining virtually. I will introduce them in a minute, but wanted to note that originally we had hoped that we would have folks from FDA as well. Unfortunately, that was not possible, so just wanted to highlight that. And today we're going to have a little bit of a hybrid approach. So we have virtual participants as well as in-person participants, and we'll also have slides as well as panel discussion. So bear with us. We have a fair amount to cover, but hopefully that will all make sense. All right, so I'm going to first introduce Sol Ruiz, who has had a great career as a regulator, is also a very fun presenter. If you've had the chance to see a presentation from Sol, she's usually full of energy and has movie references. So I've always enjoyed her presentation. So Sol is the head of the unit of biotechnology for advanced therapy at the Spanish Medicines Agency. She's also a member of the CAT at EMA, and she's also a co-opted CHMP member for quality and safety of biologics at EMA. So she's clearly a recognized expert in our field. It's also my pleasure to introduce Julian Beach, who joined the UK MHRA about 2.5 years ago. Julian is the Executive Director for Healthcare Quality and Access. Julian oversees the portfolio that is designed to ensure the quality and access of the products in the UK, so he has a large responsibility. This includes scientific advice, licensing assessment, marketing authorizations for all innovative and established medicines. And prior to joining MHRA, Julian was in industry where he gained significant experience at Novartis, Pfizer, and GSK. He was also a member of the British Pharmacopoeia, where he was the vice chair of medicinal chemistry and expert advisory group. And he was also a member of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, ABPI, so that gives you a sense of his background. I'm also very pleased to introduce Sean Russell, who is the head of regulatory affairs for the Telethon Foundation here in Italy. Telethon is a nonprofit organization focusing on helping people with rare genetic diseases, and they've contributed to the advancements of life-saving gene therapies to get to patients, such as recently Limeldi for the treatment of metachromic leukodystrophy, MLD. They were also responsible, or the driving force between the first approval for ex vivo gene therapy for rare diseases for Streamvillus for ADA-SCID. So thank you all three for joining this panel discussion. And before I start, I also want to thank Monica Veldman from ARM, who was instrumental in making this panel happen today. So I have a couple questions for us to get started. And if that's okay, I'm going to start with you, Sol. When you hear the phrase regulatory convergence, what does it mean in your context? and why do you think it could be important for the future of advanced therapies?
Well, thank you so much. And first of all, thanks so much for your kind presentation, and thanks to the organization for inviting me to be here today. So when we, as you have mentioned before in the presentation, I mean, when, regulatory convergence, I think what we have in mind is harmonization. So trying to have the same criteria for assessment. So in order to hopefully come to the same opinion. So I think even though I think it's obviously important, because I mean, whenever the criteria are the same or equivalent in different regions, I mean, this provides reliability to companies, applicants for clinical trials or marketing authorization. So indeed, this is very good. And but I would say, even though that's something that we have to continue working towards, I wouldn't say it's maybe so critical in terms of how the product is gonna do. I mean, we all have examples in mind of ATMPS that have got marketing authorization approval in different regulatory areas, and then the challenges have been, post-marketing. So, and they are not available anymore. So I think maybe the problem is more global, but certainly, I mean, any regulatory harmonization is going to be helpful for developers. Thank you.
Thank you. Julian, do you have thoughts about regulatory convergence? What comes to mind from your perspective?
Yeah, no, and echo Sol. So thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a good pleasure to be here and to see you all. For me, very much, it's about how do you speed access for patients. So we're really looking at it. You've got to look at the end goal and take the right science and get that enabling development, enabling that fast development of products, so that that they are safe first and foremost, but then they do what they say on the tin. So it's how can you make sure that the focus is not on trying to look to any particular region. It's not to look to any particular country. Is kind of their thoughts about what is right and what is wrong, but it's how can you ensure that you focus on the science and focus on that, what is needed to get to a marketing authorization at the first step, and then how do you ensure that you have the most appropriate post-market safe surveillance within a patient population. Because obviously when we're looking at these things, we're talking about various population sizes, various disease types. So what is translatable, what is not? And it's how can we use that real world data, how can we use the evidence that we're generating to ensure that we make the most rapid decisions. But then equally, and one of the things that I feel most passionately about is how do we enable that innovation? How do we enable access to medicines on the market for patients? But equally, if they are proven not to work, how do we rapidly remove them so that we are then ensuring that the patients have the best possible outcomes going forward?
Thank you. And Sean, do you have thoughts about regulatory convergence? What does it mean for you?
I have a few thoughts. And I echo Sol and Julian, so thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. For me, I echo some of their thoughts. This is about bringing products to patients. We need to get there from an industry point of view swiftly, efficiently, sustainably. Convergence will hopefully remove some of the time and the rehashing of conversations that we have in global development. At the end of the day, we need to get through an efficient development process to make sure the patients get the quickest possible access to the best possible, most efficacious, safest products. But we need to do it kind of together. If we do it in one region, another region might lag behind and the patients don't have access for a number of years afterwards. The convergence hopefully brings it to a more global approach.
Thank you. And I know you have some thoughts also on, in terms of looking at the ATMP landscape, what do you think would be, what comes to mind when you think of regulatory convergence? What would be the topic that you think could be most helpful right now?
So I think there's a few areas that are opportunities for convergence. You touched on a few in your introduction: terminology, some of the formats, the templates, the way we do things across the different regions. That would all help optimize the regulatory professional experience, shall we say. I think there's two really key areas for me that we can focus on, and they're perhaps considered short-term and long-term, and I'd welcome Sol and Julian's comments on this. In the short-term opportunities, we need to harmonize around things that are going to be close to market, close to commercialization. You'll touch on this a bit later, I'm sure, around Cogent and how bringing together 2 major agencies or 3 major agencies to review a late-stage development program would really facilitate getting that access across different countries quickly. I see that as potentially a short-term opportunity, but we know that development takes a very long time. So if we focus only on the short-term opportunities around marketing, it's going to be a very long time potentially before we see more and more of that coming through. So I think the more longer-term opportunity that we need to start working on now is around converging the earlier development activities around clinical trials, activities that will facilitate late-stage development and facilitate marketing authorizations in the longer term.
Thank you, Sean. And in the interest of time, I'm going to share my opinion on this. And one of the topics that the US group and the EU group discussed, EU regulatory and US regulatory group discussed, is that an area where we think there could be great advantage in reaching convergence is platform, or using a platform approach. So that is the concrete example that we wanted to use today. If we can go to the next slide, and then the slide after that. The next one, please. So this is just general background in terms of regulatory convergence, but there are a fair amount of activities that are ongoing at the moment. You may have heard of Project Orbis. That was initiated by the oncology division in the US. There's a pilot. I'm going quickly and happy to answer questions later, but there's a Cogent pilot that involves several agencies for gene therapy. WHO has issued a white paper that now talks about standards for global development of cell and gene therapy. IPRP is also a consortium of different regulators. They're working on cell and gene therapy. They have great thinking on platform that's emerging. And then ICH is even involved in establishing guidelines for cell and gene therapy. So that gives you some information in terms of what is regulatory, what do we mean by regulatory convergence is a thing for ATMPS. These are good examples of that. And some of the other topics that we had discussed were, for example, where there could be room for convergence between the EU and the US would be for CMC, the difference between drug substance and starting materials, maybe mutual recognition of inspections. We talked about applications like harmonizing templates and formats for application. It sounds simple, but it makes everybody's life easier because you know what to submit everywhere. And then my personal favorite is I would love for us to update our common technical document and include ATMPs in that. That's a very regulatory niche comment, but I think that would help everybody. So if we go to the next slide, we chose platform, and I wanted to give briefly, if we can go to the next slide, please, what we call the state of play. And in a nutshell, there have been a few initiatives since 2022 on platform. It started primarily in the US, but EMA joined shortly thereafter, where Fedora sort of acted into law the concept of platform. In 2022, EMA also issued a toolbox for products that are designated with a prime designation, and that has some elements that can help products expedite development. Platform technology is also mentioned in the general pharma legislation. That's still a draft here, but that's an important thing to keep in mind. I mentioned WHO already, and then FDA issued a guidance on platform technology designation in 2024. EMA Quality Innovation Group recently had a meeting where they discussed these concepts. And in the US, ARM actually was instrumental in organizing an FDA scientific exchange to advance genome editing platforms for rare diseases. And we're expecting FDA at some point to have a workshop on what they've done on platform. That's one of their commitment as part of PDUFA 7, so we'll see if that happens and when. And then if we go to the next slide, I also just briefly wanted to share what platform technology is, since this is the example we're using today. So the guidance basically summarizes the fact that a sponsor can apply for a platform technology designation. The goal is really to streamline the development and make it more efficient. It does not preclude the ability to leverage prior knowledge. So this is something we might talk about a little bit more on this panel. The concept, very simply, is to be able to reuse data from one product to a number of other products that use the same platform technology. When it's primarily for CMC, the guidance mentions non-clinical. I personally feel very strongly that it should apply to clinical, and based on informal conversations with the US regulators, that made sense to them. For example, if you're treating a disease where you have several mutations that cause this disease and you have to develop a product for each of these mutations, you may want to have a platform protocol where you would treat your patients the same way, just stratify them by mutation, for example. And just very briefly, in terms of the sort of the next steps, there are a lot of activities in terms of what platform means, and this panel is one of them. And FDA is supposed to issue a guidance on genome editing using platform technology, so we look forward to that. Good. So that was a rapid overview. I'm going to come back to our panelist. And basically wanted to ask, perhaps I'll start with you, Julian. Do you think of platform designation or platform approaches to development as a potential good topic for Convergence? The US have made some progress. I know European regulators are thinking about it. So we'd love to have your view on this.
Oh, thank you. I think it's important to distinguish what you mean actually by platforms, because they can mean different things in the different spaces. And it's how can you use that concept and primarily of prior knowledge, as you were referring to in the clinical space, to inform your development, to inform other thinking. MHRA did publish 3rd of February consultation on personalized immunotherapy guidance, which includes aspects of device and also AI, how that also links together in this space. And we've closed that consultation, but we've had lots of feedback in terms of how that can be utilized as broad concepts to underpin what would in a sense be a term of platform. For me, very much it's how can you link it to the scale of the population, the scale of the indication, and then also the scale of the patient risk. Because coming back to patients, what we've got to be looking at is how do you enable these medicines to come through in the right format? And the different technology types lend themselves differently. So I think as we go through and have these further discussions and looking at differing positions between different regulators, different thoughts, and that's great because it gets the discussion going. So one of the things coming back to that convergence, it's having enough breadth of discussion to come up ultimately with the right outcome. And that's really where looking at the ICH, looking at the IPRP, of which I know FDA, MHRA, EMA are all actively involved with, that really then drives that sense of pragmatism as to what can be then accepted within that space. So when you then look at the different things, one of the trickier areas potentially and for discussion will be around more what I would call module 3 requirements, because some of that, what you will then need to define is where the limits are. So I see that there is, in terms of in how you manufacture, and it will be an interesting discussion that we would have with companies as to how they would designate that use of prior knowledge within those manufacturing concepts. Following on from that, I think the biggest sense that I would say is very much, how can we support this? How can we then enable these different discussions to happen, of which we are having quite a number within UK? How do we ensure that that forms the basis of a long-term structure so that we can then enable that innovation to come through? So again, I would say that it is really something that each situation right now is going to be somewhat unique, but it's how can we form that collective view as to what we need. So simply, I mean, as I say quite a lot, is simply come talk to the regulator, come talk to MHRA, to have that discussion so that we can inform that opinion. Because very much I'm looking not just to stick to the sense of the guidance, but it's really what drives the science so we can improve the guidance to match it. And we should have the vision that the guidance should enable the science rather than be a preventer to it.
Thank you. I love some of the words that you mentioned, to have a customized path, get the discussion going, having a pragmatic approach. And I think you also mentioned a relevant point here, which is sponsors will need to be very clear if they want to use a platform approach or prior knowledge as to what they're leveraging and where is that information.
Yeah. And I think it's really just saying, it's what is the story? How is it then enabling that product to be, and the data to be transferred between the two, or however many you're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. Sol, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Thanks. I agree very much with what Julian has said. I mean, I think one of the difficulties is to how to define a platform. How many products make a platform? And of course, I mean, the review of the pharma legislation probably could be helpful, at least to establish that concept. But I think, I mean, we do have tools, I think, as mentioned also, that, you know, prior knowledge or what we know about certain products to speed up, you know, the process, the development of a particular product. Thinking about areas, I think probably also as mentioned, I mean, CMC probably, or certain aspects of CMC would be easier to harmonize, or even also some non-clinical aspects. And I'm thinking about products, for instance, that we have experience with many clinical trials. I mean, you know, I think it's very well established, for instance, that mesenchymal stem cells are very safe. So there are certain aspects maybe from the, you know, quality and non-clinical that we could learn and take forward to new products coming. And maybe gene therapy based on AAV vectors, we also have a lot of knowledge. So there are some aspects that we can, you know, work from in order to learn and have that knowledge. So then, you know, the development can be faster. On the other hand, I mean, you know, talking about platforms, there have been discussions like in the past. I mean, we have, for instance, you know, when we're talking about monoclonal antibodies, the manufacturing process is now very well established. You know, they share many, you know, common steps for viral safety. So there's a lot of knowledge there that we regulators can apply to new applications, even though we may not call it platform. So mRNA vaccines probably now, I mean, it's a discussion, okay, have we learned enough on mRNA COVID vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines, that we can use that as a platform? So again, I think the concept could be, you know, may have different definitions or different requirements for different people, but I think the system already has in place, you know, tools to agree on, well, what we know already for a particular product and apply it for other coming products. Thank you.
Thank you. I do agree absolutely that the concept of platform are out there and have been used. You've used the example as monoclonal antibodies. And again, I think it's a sign of maturity of our field that we're having this discussion for ATMPs. I think 15 years ago it would have been challenging. And I also want to know what you mentioned up front, which is terminology and what is platform. From our perspective within the ARM working groups, we thought that that might be a good start of the Convergence conversations. So thank you for bringing that up. And I also note your thinking around having different types of cell and gene therapy that could have sort of a codified platform approach, like AAVs. There may be certain things that would be specifically expected. I guess on that part, I would imagine that maybe specific guidance would be issued at some point in the longer term future, which might be a good complement to a platform approach. So thank you for bringing that up. Sean, what are your thoughts?
So I think the definition of platform is really key on this. And you've heard from Julian and Sol and AV, you've just reiterated it. Platform in the US has one particular meaning. Platform in the EU is potentially up for definition right now. I think this is what makes this topic a particularly interesting one around harmonization or convergence, because actually we need to work out what is an appropriate definition of a platform, and maybe that does come from different products or different themes, different streams. You might be able to converge and have a platform in the non-clinical and CMC space, but not the clinical space. Maybe that's a cross-reference or a use of prior knowledge. But again, these are very subtle terms meaning something quite similar. I think when we look specifically at some of the examples of how industry might try to use existing data or new data that's being generated, some of the themes and methodologies already exist. It's the use of prior knowledge, it's the cross-referencing of information. I think some of the challenges we see are the operational implementation of these things. In the US now, we have a platform designation that requires an authorized product. And maybe that's okay for a platform designation, but that may not facilitate early clinical development cross-referencing. That's a cross-referencing approach. And in the US, we can use specific ways to do that cross-referencing that maybe we don't have those pathways right now in Europe. So it's trying to converge around the specific topics, but also then being really clear what we mean, and then being really clear how we actually implement that.
Yeah, so I like that you're going towards cross-referencing. The next topic that I thought we could address was around the growing interest in reusing data and across different trials, which I think from my perspective in Europe can be a little complex, given that in the US there is one IND and it follows the life cycle of your product. Here you have to file CTA for each of your trials. So the concept of using a master file or modular dossiers are things that are coming up. I wanted to maybe ask you briefly, Julian, your thoughts on this with regards to how these kind of approaches, how do you think about cross-referencing and the aspect of maybe using master files to implement a platform approach?
I think the concept of them is well established, and I think it's something that absolutely can be explored. I think but it's not just in this space. I think there are a number of aspects where you can look at how we can take out sections and have them as pre-approved or pre-designated building blocks in a subsequent application. I think that concept is very reasonable to take forward, and making sure that we have that clear definition. But I come back to a point that you raised earlier, AV, in terms of, for me, it's very much about the company needing to define what they are determining within their prior knowledge, within their platform designation. It's how do we get the examples to then build up what the most appropriate concept is. where we are right now, for me, I think absolutely these are concepts to be employed, but what we don't want to be doing is putting something in that will constrain in the future when we find we may not have got it slightly incorrect from the trying to, not, I wouldn't say rush to it, but I would say that let's have the conversations and see how we can enable it within the frameworks to come up with the answers. And then we do that collaboratively between companies, regulators, and different regions to make sure that we have the best approach. But it's really looking at that. How do we find, so we're talking about, AV, we're talking about mRNA, we're talking about CRISPR technology right now. What's going to come through in 3-5 years' time that we are only briefly being aware of now, and how do we ensure that that regulation and that paradigm also fits what we may come up in that 5-year horizon or further? And that's something that I'm really keen to ensure that anything that certainly we all talk to globally enables that long-term view. Because if you think about it, the regulation that we've got now, very much kind of European based, stems from 2001 and prior to 2001. And if you look at the Medicines Act in the UK, we go back to 1968 as the first live act that we actually worked to. So it has some level of depth in terms of time, and we need to make sure that we're having the next stage and the next generation of that kind of regulation. And that's really where our thinking is right now in terms of what does that look like? How do we potentially rewrite the HMRs to concept that in terms of, and really fundamentally put that in place?
Yeah, thank you for that view. I do think often about the advancement of regulatory science alongside innovation. So I think given that this is meant to improve efficiency, that would be a shame if we put something in place that would ultimately not be useful for future technology. So that's a very good point. Thank you for that. Sol, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you. Thanks so much again. And I agree with Julian. I mean, I think that probably, the master file concept is attractive, but I think we have to be also careful on how it is applied to, innovative, very innovative developments, for instance, in ATMPS. I mean, master file obviously is a well-established concept for chemicals and it has been used, but we're talking about something that is identical to another product that is going to be used in the context of a different final product. And for ATMPS, I think, at least in my view, context is very important. I mean, maybe just to give you an example, we may be very flexible to use a particular viral vector, retroviral vector in the context of a particular, modification of a specific cell type that is going to be happening in vitro, and maybe not be so keen if the same vector is going to be used in vivo for a different cell type. So I think, it's okay. We can use, again, the prior knowledge that we have. But I think, sometimes for me, I think if we start separating parts, and for instance, maybe different assessors are involved in different parts, to me, that is a high risk. Because, again, when we're trying to make the development of certain ATMPs faster, considering all the elements of the development of the product, non-clinical, it's very important. So separating parts, I think, to me, has a risk if not the same people or the same group are involved in the assessment. So I think we do have the tools, again, to make the assessment and take information from what we already know from other products. But I don't know, maybe a note of caution on applying certain concepts to a very different kind of products. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
Could I have
Julian,
one comment?
did you want to chime in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, for me, just thinking about what Sol has just said, it just sparked something which, for me, the master file approach absolutely is something that we can consider, but it's, if you think about it from a regulator perspective, it's what story is being told by the dossier. And so it's how do you link these things together? How do you enable that review to make sure that that clear narrative of what is being asked for is expressed very coherently? And that's something that, if we look at the CTD format sometimes, it does constrain us. So if we're going to change it, and as you were saying that we could have a CTD format for ATMPs, for me, it's very much how do you ensure that the story is told by the dossier so that you can see the summary of the critical points and make the decisions very rapidly on those things which are drawn out. And that would be something I think would be very useful to have as a conversational point.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this concept of telling the story and having a clear narrative, I think, is critical, because this is going to be novel in terms of the approach of providing upfront regulators with, here is my application, please have a look at this information over here, that's my platform information, and why is it that you have this separate information in that master file or platform file? And how are you going to use it in your platforms? I completely agree with that. I also want to add that from my perspective, this platform information, and so you were referring to this risk of having discordant or challenging review if you have different pieces reviewed by different people. But ultimately, I think the platform concept is that the information in that master file would not need to be re-reviewed. It might need to be incorporated in the overall review, but ideally, it wouldn't need to be reviewed, or at least the sponsor would have confidence that that information is considered appropriate from a regulatory perspective. So I see that you wanted to chime in.
Yes, if I may. I think, it sounds very good, but even from a clinical trials perspective, and we have a large experience with clinical trials, and with the same sponsor, same product. Our experience is that, it's the same as we did before, for instance, for a CAR T cell, where it turns out that you review the documentation and it's not exactly the same. There are some changes that then need to be assessed. And it's just normal, because this is such a quickly evolving field. So I think we have to be very careful with, is the same and doesn't need reevaluation, because again, from our experience, that is not normally the case. I do not rule out that there might be cases, but when you have a particular vector and you have another application a year later, chances are that you have improved the process, have changed reagents and other things, so that are very normal in development, and it would not be exactly the same. So again, a note of caution on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's part of where the narrative part will be important. And we might start small with the validation of a method for CMC, and provided there's no change in that assay, for example, maybe that could be accepted, but understood. We have about 6 minutes left, so we have one more slide, if we can go to that, where our working groups actually thought through some of the ideas of how we could start implementing regulatory convergence for platform. And this is just illustrative, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to have sort of concluding thoughts. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So there are two parts to this slide, and I'm going to go quickly, and hopefully this just gives you a glimpse of some of the ideas that we had. But on the left, we have potential implementation mechanisms. So in the short term, for example, perhaps sponsors can use an IMPDQ approach, and there's some technicalities to that we don't have time to get into, but it's basically an IMPD that can be referenced by several CTA submissions or several trials or several products potentially, question mark. In the future, certification or qualification procedures could maybe be used about sort of having a stamp of approval for that platform information, and perhaps would then have limited review or no review. We talked about master file system. I think hopefully within the general pharma legislation, we'll get to a good place there, but for in the EU, and it sounds like in the UK you're thinking about it, but for clinical trials and for marketing applications, I think that would be really useful. It's not really the case right now, so those would be mechanisms that we think would help implementing platform. And then in terms of how to get started, perhaps starting a pilot may be something that could be considered. We would recommend starting with clinical trials before going to MAAs. Others may feel differently. We talked about NPDQ, and then the important piece for us in the working groups, again, both in Europe and in the US, and Julian, you mentioned this earlier, is to be thoughtful about keeping some flexibility in whatever approach we decide to have in Europe, so that we could have flexibility with new future modifications as well as future products that we can't really think about right now. Okay, I know that was a lot, but maybe I'll start with you, Sean, for concluding remarks, and then I will go to Saul and then Julian after that.
Sure. So I think, as you've heard, the space around convergence, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of undefineds. I think the place that we collectively as working groups and collectively as industry, along with the agencies, we're still trying to work our way through definitions, how this could work, being pragmatic but also being rigid enough but being dynamic enough to incorporate future changes. Certainly there's an existing platform for, excuse the pun, an existing platform for use of prior knowledge. I think what we're trying to move here is the environment in which it's clearer how to do that. It's clearer how to narrate your dossier, how to narrate the relevance of specific bits of information. The need to go more formalized into this platform approach or the pilot structure we've proposed here is really enabling the formalization of that. It's trying to work out how to be really efficient with development, not losing the rigor that's absolutely needed for these types of products, but enabling a sustainable and ultimately a speedy, expeditious access for patients globally.
Thank you. Saul?
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that, you know, any effort, any initiatives that is there, you know, as it was presented, I mean, it's good for this, you know, regulatory convergence. I think, well, we have obviously different regulatory requirements, different legislation in the different regulatory areas, but obviously on the scientific principles, I mean, I think we can agree, and we already have, you know, regular teleconferences on ATMPS, but also in different areas with, you know, FDA, Japan, MHRA, Health Canada. So I think those continuing efforts, and particularly, yeah, in the case of specific clinical trials, obviously could help and speed up the development. Again, a note of caution about, you know, maybe from my experience, not pursuing separation of evaluation of different parts of the dossier. I think that has not been helpful. And I just thought about an example that, you know, it's actually in the European legislation. The vaccine antigen master file is mentioned there, but has never been used. And there's a reason behind it. So I don't know. Obviously, I think we should continue the dialogue and you know, try to maybe get a specific cases or areas, quality or non-clinical, where we can agree and make you know, the development faster. But also, let's be cautious on certain concepts, because I think may even be detrimental for the development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Julian, your concluding thoughts for the audience? Oh, we can't hear you. You might be on mute.
I was, sorry. No, basically I was agreeing with my panelists, colleagues. but also looking at why are we doing this is coming back to the patient. So everything we've got to be looking at is how do we bring patient groups, patient communities along with us along this journey, because there's got to be a culture shift with this as well within the patient view about the acceptance of these novel technologies and how they can be then proven to work or not. And so that ultimately it's the speed, it's the having the regulatory platforms there that fit what a patient needs. And we've got to be working it back from that, in my view, as much about looking as the science. So that would be the only additional thought that I would add to this, but the rest of it in terms of collaboration, in terms of working together with harmonized approaches, I think has got to be the way forward.
Great. Thank you so much. I clearly heard cautious optimism, so that's fantastic. And certainly keeping the patients as our true north, I think, is key, and I believe everybody feels that way here in the room. So thank you so much, Sol, Julian, and Sean, for joining this panel discussion. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time for questions, but we'll stay here in person a little bit if there are questions to discuss. But thank you so much again for joining this discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Have a great day.
Yes, thank you.